Good evening, everybody, and welcome to week 3 of our Christian Believer Bible study, and welcome to everybody joining us online. So for this week's lecture, if you're looking at the handout, I want to just tell you up front that the first 3 Roman numerals that the lecture is going to cover is stuff that is absolutely essential, really good to know for every Christian to be a good Christian. Roman numerals 4 and 5 are going to make your head hurt. That's just the nature of whenever we're talking about creation and God and time, we're going to need to stretch ourselves to think through things that are outside of our even possible experience as human beings. So all that is to say, if we get to Roman numerals 4 and 5 and you leave here going, I have no idea what Pastor Ian just said, that is okay. You are still going to be just fine in your journey of faith as long as you pay attention for 1, 2, and 3. So let's get started. Today we're talking about the doctrine of creation. And when we're talking about the doctrine of creation, I want to start by saying what we're not talking about. So very specifically, the doctrine of creation is not talking about the details of how the material world came to be. So the doctrine of creation is not having anything to do with the Big Bang or with evolution or with any of the material ways that we can measure and view and see the history of our material world. Saying God is the creator is talking about the relationship between God and the universe as a whole. We call this in theology, and this term is going to be important for you to keep in your mind, the creator-creation distinction. And what the creator-creation distinction is all about is the very fundamental belief that God is not one thing among other things within the universe. So when we're talking about God in a Christian setting, this is what is going to put us out of step with most pagan faiths. So most of pagan faiths, Zeus, Odin, Ra, all of these supreme deities are not per se, outside of the natural order. They live, they die, they fight each other, they form pre-existent matter, but at the end of the day, the universe was around before them, and they have come to be within it, even if they're shaping it into something new. Christianity says that's not how God is. The Christian view is that God is outside the universe, and that the universe is dependent upon God. This is where we get the traditional doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. And this is not unique to Christianity. Later, Judaism is going to have this. Islam has this. Several now Abrahamic faiths are going to have creatio ex nihilo. We see creatio ex nihilo begin actually not in Genesis, but in the book of Job. When you notice in Genesis, God is in a watery void forming matter that's already there. The reason that it's important to make that clear is that creatio ex nihilo is a doctrine that develops over time. It's not something that's necessarily in the mind of the biblical authors as they're writing the stories that will get recorded in Genesis. It is seeming to be fully formed by the time we get to Job. So in Job, remember, you have God talking about all of the wondrous things that God makes, and he talks about how the waters, the sea, bursts forth from his womb. So in Genesis, we have God hovering over the primordial chaos and forming it into something else. In Job, we have God being separate from that primordial chaos and the source of that primordial chaos. So, creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing, it might be better said to be God is not forming the world from stuff. God first creates nothingness. Because I want you to think about that. If God is all there is before creation, there isn't nothingness yet. God has to create something other than God's self, and that's the nothingness. So within that, God is now forming the nothingness into creation when we get into our creation stories. The doctrine of creatio ex nihilo also says that the nothing that God is creating from is truly different than God. So God is also not creating out of himself. If faiths say that God is creating out of himself, that's called pantheism. That says that the universe is itself divine and co-eternal with God. And we say, no, the universe is the universe and God is God. And God has created nothingness and then formed it into something, and God is always outside of that. There is a real difference. So something is either God or universe, but there is a real break between the one who creates and the creation. Later on, that's why the idea of an incarnation, God entering the universe and becoming enfleshed in Jesus Christ, is so wild, because it breaks the creator-creation distinction. This is one reason that Judaism and Islam and several other world religions are going to reject the idea of an incarnation because of a very strong creator-creation distinction in those faiths. Now, when we're saying that God is very completely other than creation and that creation depends on God for existence, this also means that God does not just create and then things have an independent existence. So, God is always continuing that work of creation because everything at every moment depends upon God. So we would say that this is God as sustainer, not creatio ex nihilo, but creatio continua. God is always continuing to create. It's why we think that deism is particularly incoherent. Because in deism, God creates stuff and then walks away and lets it run on its own. Theism is going to reject that. We're going to say that doesn't make sense. Creation itself is only held in existence by the continuous will of God. If God ever stops willing for creation to be, it would just blip away. Now, I want us to also think about what this means in terms of God's independence. God's independence is related to creatio ex nihilo because if God has to create the nothingness for creation to happen in, it means that as God is making space for creation, and since creation is not out of God's essence or out of God's substance, then creation does not affect God. And we don't like this one because we want to, have a difference, make a difference, even to God. We don't. Nothing in this world can hurt God. Nothing in this world can make God happier than God already is. God is fully self-sustained within himself. Nothing in this world can threaten God's existence. Nothing in this world can make God more joy-filled or less joy-filled than God already is. God creates not because God has to, and God does not create because God gets anything out of creation. Now, this seems a little bit dispassionate, right? We don't love this, but it highlights the pure grace of creation. That creation is not something God had to do. Creation is not something that God is doing for God's benefit at all. Creation is singularly something that God does as a pure gift for creation itself. Now, the doctrine of creation is also going to have implications for how we look at good and evil. So in some faiths, you have the idea of the eternality of two opposing forces, whether that's, spirit and matter, light and dark, yin and yang, good and evil. Those religions tend to be focused on some kind of balance. Christianity rejects this view. For Christians, all creation comes from God, and God only creates good things. This means that, contra to many Eastern religions that have a yin and a yang, there's no yin and yang. There's only the light side. That's all that exists. Contra to Gnosticism that views spirit as good and any material stuff as bad, God creates material stuff. Material stuff is good. There's nothing that God creates that is bad. There is no equal, co-eternal anything that is alongside God. So there's only God and God's goodness, and there is only creation of good things. Now, where does bad come from then, if it's not a co-eternal primeval power? The Christian view is that evil is not a substantial entity in itself. There is no substance of evil. Rather, the Christian view is that evil is a corruption of a good thing. So evil is not a thing in itself. It is a corruption or a misuse of something good. An image that I like to use is that God can create a mirror that then gets misused by being smashed, and it has jagged, pointy edges that can hurt. Those jagged, pointy edges don't have substance in themselves. It is a misuse of the good mirror. Now, when we are looking then at humanity, if we have choice, which we do, then evil is always a possibility because we can always choose to misuse something good. So if you want to talk about why is there evil, it's because evil is always a condition of choice, not as a substantial thing, but because choice means the choice to misuse, the choice to destroy, the choice to corrupt. The good news in this is that if evil is not a thing in itself, it's not equal to God, that means that evil ultimately cannot win. Because evil is always just a parasite. It's always subordinate to God because evil only exists within the created order. Whereas God, the full source of goodness, is above the created order and ultimately bringing it to its conclusion. So it's important for us, when we're thinking about the battle between good and evil, this is not two equal-sized forces going at it. This is the Creator in goodness and part of his creation that has a parasite on it. So the devil is not an equal and opposite force to God. The devil is an unruly child that is throwing a tantrum, whereas God is the benevolent Father. Now, creation, when we're thinking about creation from a purely materialistic point of view, so if God was out of the picture and we accept the atheist claim, there is a beginning, a set start of creation, but everything else that happens is really just the outworking of natural laws and towards entropy. It's kind of a wide open canvas, but at the end is nothingness. Christianity says that creation has a specific purpose that it is moving towards. So creation is not set on a trajectory of unknowns or towards nothingness. Rather, there is a set thing that God has placed in our future that we are moving towards and that God has set us on that direction. And so the question is, what is that thing? That thing, as we're told in the epistle that Peter writes, is to become partakers of the divine nature. I want you to hear that again. Our goal is to become partakers of the divine nature. And when he talks about the goal of humans, remember, humans are just the pinnacle of creation. We are creation that can think. So our goal, our destiny, is the goal of the created order, because we are the mouthpiece of the created order. That means that God creates creation to fully share in everything that makes God God. It is a pure gift that God gives to what he creates to share in his majesty and in his glory and in his happiness and in the eternal relationship that is marked by the love that the Father has for the Son within the Holy Spirit. That's a lot of words to come back around to just what Paul says in Romans when he says that God works all things for good for those who love him, and that we have been predestined to be conformed to Christ Jesus. All of time and history has one singular end that God has made it for, and that is to grow into the likeness of everything that Jesus is. So all of the divine humanity that Jesus is by nature, all of creation experiences by grace. So that's the ultimate goal. And this starts to make sense of what it's not just God's eternality when we talk about God being the Alpha and the Omega. Because as we read in John, Jesus Christ is the Creator. Right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. The Word was God. He was with God in the beginning, and all things came into being through him. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Jesus Christ is the creator of the world, and Jesus Christ is the goal of the world. So when you think about why did God create? God created for Jesus to become like Jesus. And we're on that trajectory. One slight derivation from this, because it's a pet peeve of mine that Christians do, and I'm going to let you in on it. Don't ever let a pastor, whether me, if I'm not thinking about it, or Pastor Jenny, or whoever replaces us, don't let them get away by trying to replace the Trinitarian persons with Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. God does all those things, but all of the persons of the Trinity do all of those things. So Jesus is the Creator. The same person that died on that cross is the one that created the world, equally to the Father and Spirit. The Father was equally involved in our redemption as Jesus Christ. So the Holy Spirit is all the way through every act that God does. All that is to say, don't let pastors get away with, this is a technical term, the heresy of modalism. Right? The heresy of modalism. If you hear someone talk about the Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer, you say, that's modalism. And don't let them get away with it. Okay, back to our regularly scheduled programming. So now we're going to get into the more heady part. So see if you can follow along with me. Do your best. One of the things that modern science really helps us out with is talking about God being separate from the universe and the implications that that has, not just on the idea of the universe being dependent on God and having God as its origin and goal, but also our relationship as beings in time to a God who is eternal. Here's why modern science is helpful. There's been lots of speculation throughout the millennia about whether there is time for God. is God subject to a sequence of events? And it's weird because if God is subject to a sequence of events, that opens up the possibility for God to change, which also opens up the possibility for God to really change. If God changes, then God is able to have some power exercised on him because there is something about God that can become. If God can change, then God might not be trustworthy. God could just not fulfill the promises that God made. If God can change, then our faith becomes a little wobbly. We know that God is going to be around forever, but is that an absolute kind of existence, or is that just like a superhuman, just immortal, vampire-like existence? The interesting thing about the last couple hundred years in physics is the growing awareness that time is bound up within space. So space-time as a thing. This was a lot to do with Einstein's idea of relativity, that your speed through space is warping time as well. But what that shows is that time is part of creation. Time is not independent of creation. That's why there's no before the Big Bang. Time is bound up with the fabric of space-time. And if all of creation is separate from God and dependent on God, that means God stands outside of time. This is going to get wonky for us, right? Because we cannot experience the world as anything but within time. This also means that when we're talking about our experiences and our relationship with God, we can only describe those experiences and that relationship as something that happens in time. But if we know that God is not existent within time, but is beyond time, that means that when we hear about God acting, we have to abstract that out and realize that that's a metaphor. The same way that when we talk about God's hands or God's breath, we know that that's a metaphor because God doesn't have a body. So let's think about that when it comes to God in relation to history. If God is outside of time, this is going to affect the way that we look at God's knowledge and how God relates to each moment in time. So God being outside of time means that God exists presently in every moment. God is not in the past, present, or future. God is everywhere all at once. This means that at this moment, God is experiencing creation. At this moment, God is experiencing us right now. At this moment, God is experiencing the end and the fulfillment of all the world. This means that as God is looking down, God sees the full course of human history all at once. This is how we're going to talk about God's foreknowledge and how God knows what's going to happen without forcing it to happen, is that God is at every moment that ever was or ever will be. So when we're thinking about God intervening in creation, this means that God is not at the beginning of creation, kind of watching it go as it goes along, knocking us in, hemming us in when we get off track. Rather, it's more helpful to think about God standing at the future, at the culmination of everything, helping us pull through history, already seeing the steps in front of us. And the reason that I think that's helpful is that obviously God is in the past, but if we experience God as creating us and pulling us through history from the future, it helps us get into our mind why faith in God ends up being the most rational thing we can have. Because God is in the culmination, and so trusting in God is trusting in the one who is there at every step of the way and can actually bring us to the fulfillment which is himself. Now, remember, God has a specific goal for us, that is union with himself. Basically, we are always stepping one more step towards God into the future, and God is waiting for us there. So as we're thinking about God and time, God is right now at the moment of your death. God is right now at the moment of the resurrection of the dead. God is right now in the life of the world to come. Therefore, right now, God can help us navigate that way, because God already is at every step. This is also what makes human freedom possible. In a strictly materialistic worldview, humans do not have true freedom. Because freedom is the ability to move forward according to a real choice. In a purely materialistic worldview, everything we are is just one more outworking of the natural laws of the universe. There's electrical impulses in our brain. If we can just get physics right close enough, we can predict anything that will ever happen, right? Just because we can't, that's the implication of the materialistic worldview. That what's in front of us is just nothingness, is entropy. And as you know, that means that we don't really have a future. And anything that only has a past but has no future is dead. That's just the definition of what it means to be dead. If God, though, stands outside of time, if God from without the universe acts within the universe to bring it to a goal, that means that the brute mechanics of space-time is not all that is at work within our lives. That there is something more that we are constantly stepping into, that there is something more that is constantly pulling us through to a given goal that has already been attained within God. Basically, our future is determined by more than just our past and our life circumstances. That's what we mean by when we say the doctrine of creation makes true freedom possible. Because it means that our future actually has real options, because God is there guaranteeing our freedom, not just the brute outworking of matter. One more image that I want to put in your head, because it came up in the morning session. Somebody asked a question about, how does it make sense for God to both experience the flow of time and be outside of it? The historic view is that that's a holy mystery, right? We can't quite put that into words. One common image is that God is like watching a parade route from on top of a mountain. So as everybody else is experiencing the parade as the flow of time as it moves past them, God is seeing it all at once in its totality. Obviously, that has limitations. The limitations that we're also going to get when we're talking about God and time is that when we think about God in Scripture, there are times that it seems that God is changing. There's plenty of stuff in the Old Testament that God changes God's mind. How do we make sense about that? And this is where I wanted us to think about how we need to abstract this out, the same way that we do when they talk about God's body. If God is an absolute, unchanging point, and humans change, that does mean that our relationship to the single unchanging God is going to be altered. So if humans start over here and they say to go to God, you have to go, up and over, and then God tells them You need to go up and over the other direction. God has not changed God's mind, but the position of humanity relative to God has changed. So this is how we start to make sense about those biblical passages that talk about God changing. As humans shift relative to the absolute God, it seems that God has changed, but that's a perception difference, not a substantial difference within the Godhead. Okay, that's all I got for you. You can go to breakouts. I'll be around for questions.